Hi, my name is Dan O'Connor. I'm Head of Research and Environment at Wellcome, and before that I was Head of Humanities and Social Science.
Hello, my name is Megan Reitz. I'm Professor of Leadership and Dialogue at Ashridge Hult Executive Education. My area of research and passion is within organisational dialogue, the way we communicate and encounter one another inside organisational systems.
My talk today is called Private Foundations, Public Obligations, Wellcome and Research Culture. And it's an attempt to answer this big question, which is on my next slide. And that question is, what is the relationship between Wellcome's status as a private charitable foundation and the work we're doing in research culture? And I'm asking this question in an attempt to take a couple of steps back from the coalface work of research culture and think about this from a theoretical and conceptual point of view so that we can have some robust and rigorous thinking as we go forward into research culture. And on my next slide, I'll give you the outline of my talk today. So first of all, I'll give a little background on Wellcome's commitment to improving research culture, what we've been doing and the progress that we've made so far. And then I'm going to take us to some of the controversial and interesting arguments that have been going on around the roles that private charitable foundations like Wellcome play in the public sphere. And then, riffing off that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the freedom that private charitable foundations enjoy and the accountability they should be under and the obligations that they have. And then I'm going to talk about a recent example at Wellcome where we've tried to put some of this theory about freedom and obligations into practice when it comes to research culture. And then I'll talk a little bit about future possibilities for research culture at Wellcome and then finish up with a conclusion. So let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about Wellcome and research culture. As many of you know, and the reason that you're all here at this fantastic culture festival is that Wellcome and many people in the research environment have been thinking about positive and negative aspects of research culture. And at Wellcome, we've very much been in what we would call research and campaign mode. The picture here is from the report into the survey and research we did. Thousands of people responded talking about the positive and negative aspects of contemporary research culture. And Wellcome has kicked off a campaign accepting and acknowledging that we really need to change the way research culture works. Everything from representation through to bullying, to precarity, to the publish and perish model. Don't need to go through all of that with you. At Wellcome, we genuinely believe that improving research culture is the right thing to do, morally and practically. But where does that belief come from? And what does it tell us about Wellcome's position in the research environment? Let's take a look at the next slide. Wellcome is part of a research environment in which private charitable foundations play a huge role. And in the past decade or so, critique of Wellcome and Gates and other major charitable foundations has become more and more vocal. And the three books here are just a couple of examples of the in-depth and often extremely valid critiques that can be applied to private charitable foundations. We've got Lindsay McGooey there, No Such Thing as a Free Gift, which explores the role of the Gates Foundation in philanthropy. Rob Reich's book, Just Giving, on how philanthropy fails democracy. And Anand Giridharadas' book, Winner Takes All, the elite charade of changing the world. There's pros and cons to all of these books and all of these arguments, and at another time I'd love to get into a deep sort of critical analysis of them. But suffice to say, on the next slide, we can draw some broad conclusions from these critiques of private charitable foundations, if we skip on to the next slide. So Reich, for example, talks about how, and I quote, "Big philanthropy is definitely a plutocratic voice in our democracy, an exercise of power by the wealthy that's unaccountable, non-transparent, donor-directed, perpetual and taxed, subsidized. It's an exercise of power, and in a democracy, any form of concentrated power deserves scrutiny and not gratitude." And so this is one of the key critiques of private charitable foundations like Wellcome, which is that it really operates with huge amounts of freedom, but very little oversight and very little accountability. And Joanne Barkan, whose work I didn't mention in the previous slides, has a great and very pithy quote about this. Because they're free to do what they want, mega foundations threaten democratic governance and civil society. Wealth in capitalist society already translates into political power, and big philanthropy reinforces this tendency. And this very much gets at why I call my little talk today Private Foundations and Public Obligations. We are operating in the public sphere, but we don't necessarily have all the democratic checks and balances applied to us that public bodies, indeed businesses and corporations, often do. We just move on to the next slide. So this, in short, is the argument that's made about private charitable foundations like Wellcome, that they often exercise influence in important areas of the public sphere, like health research, without the kinds of accountability, be it taxpayer accountability or shareholder accountability, that other public actors have. And in doing so, there is an argument that private foundations undermine democratic control of the public sphere, the idea that the people and the public ought to have a say over what happens in the public sphere. And finally, and quite interestingly, the critique that private foundations can exacerbate or even be a cause of the problems that they seek to solve. And so in thinking about research culture and improving research culture, which I'm sure everyone agrees is a good thing, how can we take into account these criticisms of private charitable foundations and think about Wellcome's role in improving and bettering research culture? Let's take a look at the next slide. So we're talking now about private foundations and public obligations. And bearing in mind what I think are those powerful critiques of private charitable foundations, when Wellcome seeks to work in improving research culture, and again, I don't think anyone would suggest that improving research culture is something no one doesn't want to do. We're all in favor of improving research culture, but we have to think about what Wellcome's role is. And so first of all, I think it's important for Wellcome and other private charitable foundations to acknowledge our own place in the research culture system, how we may in the past have been the cause of problems around publish or perish, for example, the way in which we assess applications, the way in which certain communities may find it more or less difficult to apply for Wellcome funding. Wellcome hasn't come to research culture completely naively. We have and need to accept that we have been part of a system that consciously or unconsciously has created negative aspects of a research culture. Secondly, once we've acknowledged that, and this is fairly basic moral philosophy, one might say, Wellcome has an obligation with all our freedom not to make things worse when we try to do something in research culture. Any actions we take, the bottom line has to be that we don't want unintended consequences. And that puts on us a huge burden of responsibility to do research and to make sure that our activities in the research culture sphere are being checked against the outcomes that we're looking to see and making sure that we're not making things worse as we go along. Thirdly, the freedom that Wellcome enjoys, all the money that we have and the sort of soft accountabilities that we have mean that we also have a responsibility to make the best use of our freedom. Wellcome and other private charitable foundations can take risks, we can be very agile, and we can sometimes move in areas that public bodies, because of their slightly more stringent accountabilities, are unable to do so. So what are the areas of research culture where Wellcome can take risks and push the boundary? And finally, if we're going to say we want to improve and better research culture, we have to be accountable for that. And to whom do we need to be accountable? We need to be accountable to you, the researcher community. And I'll talk a little bit now, I'll move to the next slide, about how that might work. And I want to do that by talking about a recent example from Wellcome, which were the Research Development Awards, which was something of an experimental one-off research scheme, research grant scheme that we ran last year, and will actually be making the first awards later this month. The Research Development Awards were a completely new research scheme. And the idea with them was to develop completely new research agendas in the humanities and social sciences as they relate to health. And a brief reminder here that Wellcome isn't just a biomedical funder. We're a big funder of humanities, social science, and bioethics too. The whole idea of this research scheme was that there would be no research questions in the applications. The big exciting thing for us was your research vision. what you thought your field of inquiry might look like in the next 5 to 10 years, and the sorts of activities you would do to flesh out that vision. But there didn't need to be work packages, 1, 2, 3, sub-questions, 4.5, methodologies, formats, frameworks weren't relevant. What was interesting to us was the excitement. 50% of the assessment was on that exciting vision, and 50% was on research culture and leadership. 50%, a whole half of the assessment, was on the way in which the applicants would foster a positive research culture, how they would do mentoring and leadership, and how decision-making and power would be shared across the research group, the visionary group. And we would allow the funds to be as unrestricted as possible. The whole point of this was to try and do away with some of the difficulties in contemporary research culture that are often metrics driven and insist on very specific deadlines, very specific goals within things, and to take some of Wellcome's freedom, the freedom we enjoy, and redistribute it outwards to the research community. Crucially as well, when we expect 50% of the assessment to be about a positive research culture, we thought it was really important that we reciprocate that. And that if we expect positive research culture actions and behaviours from you as the research community really ought to be able to expect that from us. And so we changed the way we did applications. We were much more involved. We were much more open to giving positive and negative feedback. And we tried to remove the sort of adversarial sense of things as well. And we gave people plenty of time to have contact with Wellcome, to get the feedback and the critiques that they needed to make their applications as positive and as competitive as possible. And this really gets back to that moral obligation thing. If Wellcome, as a private funder operating in the public sphere of health research, is going to insist that research culture is important, we have to put together research grant application schemes like this that enable you to take the actions and undertake the activities that are going to support a positive research culture. As I said, these awards are going to be made for the first time later this month. And I hopefully, maybe in 3 or 4 years' time, I'll be able to come back to some successor event to this, maybe with some representatives of the group we fund, to talk about how this has worked and how it's worked well, or perhaps how it hasn't worked out at all. The point there being that Wellcome is in a position to take this kind of risk. And it's our job really as a private charitable foundation to take that kind of risk in research culture. Let's kick on to the next slide. So what then are those future possibilities? Wellcome has, as I said, been in campaign mode and in research mode. And next, our job really is to start thinking about what we can do to positively impact the research culture. And to do so, we have to recognise that we're part of that culture, and we have to recognise our own role in perpetuating some of those negative aspects of research culture. As a private charitable foundation, in the future, we've got an obligation not just to spend our money wisely, but to spend our money in ways that make the most of our defining characteristics, freedom and influence. And I believe that the best way for Wellcome to approach research culture is not to set up another series of targets and metrics, but to give you guys in the researcher community the freedom and resources that we have in order to enable the research culture to thrive. And of course, Wellcome will try to hold people to account for that research culture, but that has got to be reciprocal in the future. You have to hold us to account for when we're failing in terms of promoting a positive research culture. Otherwise, we're all just reinforcing the problem all over again. And so finally, to conclude, I think Wellcome is at on the final slide, Wellcome is very much at the beginning of a journey in research culture. We have to acknowledge where we are, our part in the research ecosystem. I myself have just been appointed head of research environment. The role and the team that I'm building at the moment are part of a commitment on the behalf of Wellcome to really improving research culture, to being accountable for what we do in research culture. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing how we can work together in the future. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you.
Hello everybody. I'm going to talk with you for the next 15 minutes or so about something that I call conversational habits. Now, conversational habits we have as individuals and in our teams and in our organisations. And you can describe them as sort of stuck patterns in when we speak up and when we stay silent, and stuck patterns around whose voice we hear and whose voice we discount or ignore. And these conversational habits have big consequences. They have huge consequences in research teams, obviously. And some of the organisations that you'll see on the screen now have been on the front page of the newspaper for all the wrong reasons, because somebody wasn't able to speak up, or if they did, they weren't heard. So there can be major negative consequences of silence, but of course there can be very positive consequences if you can create habits in a team where it's okay to stick up your hand and say, I've got an idea, or okay to stick up your hand to say, I'd like to really challenge the way that we're thinking about this. I think there's a different way. Okay, if you can do that in a team, it's possible to create really innovative thinking and innovative working. But of course, conversational habits taken to the extreme, and I've studied many of these, can even cost lives. So they can cost lives if we can't speak up around mistakes. It can cost lives if we can't talk about mental health issues. It can cost lives when sectors of society are silenced. So conversational habits is what I want to talk to you about. And I want you to reflect on your own habits and the habits within the teams that you're in at the moment. And first of all, before I dive into some of the research findings that I've come up with over the last 7 years or so, I want to point out two big mistakes that I see teams making at the moment. And I wonder whether you've seen this happen as well. So the first mistake in a team and as an individual is we kind of point at other people, don't we? And we kind of go, they should speak up more, or they should speak up differently, or more assertively, or this or that. They need to be brave. Well, when I first started studying this subject, the two organisations that I went to, first of all, said exactly the same thing. And so I went to speak to they, and direct quote in the organisations that I work with was this: last time somebody spoke up, they disappeared. So it became very obvious very quickly that yes, of course, we need to focus on people speaking up. We need to focus on ourselves being able to speak up courageously. But frankly, if you only focus on that, it's a complete waste of time and resources unless we're also focusing in on creating an environment which is safe to speak up. In other words, why do we have to be so brave to speak up in the first place? So a lot of my research focuses in on listening up. The other mistake that I'm seeing more and more, and especially over the last year or so, is this. I have organisations, or very often leaders, wanting their teams to speak up and saying and encouraging them, come on, speak up. We really want you to do this. And so people go, okay, right, you want me to speak up? Okay, I'll speak up. Now, let's talk about climate change. Let's talk about Black Lives Matter. What about executive pay, sexual harassment? And I've had a few leaders kind of go, oh, didn't really want you to speak up about that. Can we just kind of stick to ideas and mistakes? And again, this shows like a really big misunderstanding, is if you're wanting to create a speak up culture, you can't really pick and choose. And some of the ways that we help people to feel safe are going to result in all sorts of conversations coming up. And so leaders and managers and all of us need to be ready for that. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the reasons why we choose to speak up and stay silent, and why we choose to listen to some people and not others. Now, in my research, I use a framework which is called the Truth Framework, and it picks apart some of the habits that we have in order that we might be able to disrupt them. So when I want to speak up, I usually think about, do I trust my own opinion? Am I aware of the risks, or what risks do I perceive in speaking up? Do I understand the power and the politics and people's agendas here? What are the titles and labels that I apply to myself and others, which either make me feel like I have the status and authority to speak up, or they make me think I can't and I shouldn't? And if I want to speak up, do I know how? Do I have the forum and the opportunity to be able to speak up? So all of those things are factors that I'm considering, and they're also considered when we listen up. Do we trust the value of someone else's opinion? Do we appreciate how risky they might feel it is to speak up? Do we understand how power and politics get in the way very often of us hearing certain things? Again, titles and labels. How do I label other people, and how does that affect whether I listen to them or not? And do I have the skills needed to invite others to speak up to the best of their ability or not? So the Truth Framework kind of sets out why we make the choices we do. Now, obviously, in this kind of little talk here, I can't go into each of these areas, but I do want to focus on the listening up because it's so important. And here's one thing I want to highlight to you. A bubble. We're all in a bit of a bubble. I'm afraid to say the more senior you are as well, the more likely you'll be in what I call an optimism bubble. So first thing, we all, no matter who we are, we all seem to suffer from something I call superiority illusion. We kind of think, my data would indicate, we've surveyed about 8,000 people now globally. Data's pretty clear that we tend to rate ourselves reasonably well at speaking up and very well at listening up. It's just the other people that are the problem. Okay, so superiority illusion, it's a little bit like if I ask you, are you a good driver? Most of you would probably say you're above average, and exactly the same is with speaking and listening up. The problem is if we are all thinking that we're okay, but it's everybody else that needs to change, of course nothing happens. So we need to be a bit aware of the superiority illusion. Second thing we need to be aware of is something that I call advantage blindness. So I mentioned a second ago the titles and the labels that we apply to ourselves and other people. So you've been applying titles and labels to me as soon as I started talking. You'll have applied the labels of female, white, British, something to do with age, appearance, all sorts of other things. And each of these titles and labels convey different levels of status and authority, depending on the context that we're in. Okay. Now, the interesting thing is that if we possess titles and labels that convey status and authority, that convey advantage. So, for example, still with many exec teams I work with across Europe, many of the exec team members might be male, white, and also possess executive titles. So those three taken together very often convey status and authority. When we have these high status labels, we're often the last people to realise their impact. It's not until we don't have those labels that we look at them and go, my goodness, they make a difference. So advantage blindness means, unfortunately, we have to work really hard to realise the challenges that other people might have. And we've written quite extensively on advantage blindness and how you kind of move and shift out of that. But we need to realise, particularly as senior leaders. You know, again, the data is very clear here. As you get more senior, you become more optimistic. You think other people are fine. You think other people are speaking up. You think that you're quite good at listening. You think that you're pretty approachable. I hate to tell you that it's probably not as high as you think it is. Okay, you'll tend to overestimate those things, and actually if you look underneath that, other people will be having different experiences. Finally, of course, especially when we're more senior, but again, whoever we are, it's actually really difficult to get good feedback. So we're in a lovely little bubble and no one's going to burst it because of the person that we are, or because people are concerned about upsetting or embarrassing us. Okay, so how do we get out of this bubble? Let me take you through, finally, 3 traps that my research has highlighted and are things to look out for, particularly for leaders, but for all of us in teams. Okay, these apply to all of us in one way or another. The first is that we forget how scary we are. Now, some of you are probably listening to that and kind of going, what? I'm not scary, I'm lovely. And you may well be, I'm sure you are, but to other people, there might be reasons why they hold back from speaking with you. And it might be your title or background or who you know. It might be that they think you're confident, whether you are or not. But some people will probably hesitate before speaking to you. So we need to see ourselves as other people do. So ask yourself the question, who might hesitate before they openly speak to you? You know, who might be kind of wary? And of course, this is all around how do we invite people to speak up in a way that they'll feel safe. And honestly, we need to do far more work than we realise in that area. Secondly, I talk about little lists, and this is from an interview that I had with the chief executive quite early on in the research. And we were asking him about his team speaking up. He found that really important. And he said to us, the problem is I do have a little list in my mind of the people that fit and the people that don't. Now, all of us have in our mind a kind of little list of these are the people that I go to when I seek opinions. These are the people that I'll stop everything and listen to. And these are the people who actually I either don't know are there or I kind of discount their views. Now, this isn't about getting rid of the list. That's impossible. But we do need to be able to question it. Why are these people on this list and these people on this list? Do those people look exactly like you and sound like you? In other words, are you in a bit of an echo chamber? And this, of course, is the territory of unconscious bias, which can be quite uncomfortable for all of us to approach and try and understand. But these labels and titles affect us all. And the worst thing we can do is to think that they don't affect us. Okay, so we need to reach out and connect with difference. Final trap that I just wanted to take you through is we sometimes send signals that silence others in our team. Now, you might have noticed this on Zoom if you've been on perpetual Zoom meetings like I have. You know how you can kind of see your face on Zoom? Have you ever kind of glanced at yourself and thought to yourself, oh my goodness? Well, I sometimes, when I'm really interested, I have what I call a thinking face. And occasionally I've glimpsed that on my screen and I've thought to myself, I look thoroughly intimidating. Okay, so signals is about, a colleague of mine has a great phrase, know your face. Know the signals that you're sending, because sometimes those signals are the ones that will silence somebody just in that moment. And in particular, know the signals that you send when somebody has just spoken up, because your response affects whether they'll speak up again and whether their colleagues will. a very quick introduction to some of the research that I've done and some of the things that can affect you in your research teams. You know, remember, speaking up and listening up. These are incredibly important habits. And speaking up is relational. It depends on someone listening up. And I'd argue that perhaps we need to focus more on that area. We're not as good as we think we are, I'm afraid. And the more senior you are, the more optimistic you get. You know, we all actually are in this bubble that we may need to burst somewhat in order to help our teams innovate and be the best that they possibly can be. So any kind of culture change or development in your team will require you to alter your conversational habits. And if you wanted to find out more, there's just some indications there of things to look out for. Hope you found that thought-provoking and maybe consider altering a little bit the next conversation that you might have.
To reimagine our current research culture, we all need to share our ideas and do our part. Through our cafe culture kits, we ask the researcher community to share solutions to some of the concerns that we've heard about. Some of these ways were shared on our online ideas forum, where people commented and voted on different ways to improve culture. These ideas have been helping Wellcome and other organisations to put change into action. And we're now going to move into some questions.
I'm Shauna Duggan, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bristol. My idea for a healthier research culture is to give PhD students training on key areas like grant writing and publishing papers to encourage independence and ownership. So I'd like to ask the panel, what training should we offer early career researchers to support them in their careers?
Firstly, I would recommend that we help early career researchers to understand issues of power and politics, because they're present. They'll always be present in the research teams that they work with, and yet we often try and disappear power and politics and influence. So I would kind of get that on the agenda fairly early on with early career researchers, and also trying to help them identify what would help them to speak up and be heard. So some of my research also examines the traps that we often fall into around that. So for example, many of us have quite a big imposter voice in our head, particularly when we start our careers. You know, we have a little voice that pipes up and says, no, I can't speak up about this, or I'll look silly if I do this. And it's very helpful for us to be able to look at that voice not as truth, but as something that actually can be engaged with and sometimes overridden, actually. So I would probably help them to understand imposter voice. I'd help them to understand their values and how to speak up if those values are kind of challenged in any way, and also how to speak up in a way that that person is able to hear you. And there's some real skills and strategies around that. Finally, I'd spend ages supporting them, as you can hear. My final point would be around other research that I've done, which is on mindfulness. And lots of that research helps you to understand how to be resilient, but also how to be compassionate towards ourselves and others. And again, you know, not something that's usually on the agenda of early career researchers or any other type of profession, actually, but one that I think is absolutely fundamental.
I'm Valentina Yemmi, an LSE Fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science. My idea to create a better research culture is to recognize and remunerate all the hidden work that people do, such as peer reviewing of research grants, articles, books, and advisory roles. So I would like to ask the panel, how should we reward work that contributes to a healthy research culture?
As a former academic, I'm not sure how far peer review does add to it. It certainly never made me feel like I was part of a positive research culture, but I take the point of the question. Absolutely. I think we have to expand the universe of what counts, right? And it's not just peer reviewing and mentoring and things like that. There's all sorts of elements of academic and research service that are never captured on grant applications or on tenure and promotion forms or things like that. And I don't need to enumerate them for you now, but what I will say is that often those types of service, those types of care work, tend to be done or tend to be foisted onto women academics. And so the work that women academics do to keep the wheels moving on the research enterprise is often sorely under-recognized. And of course, it's not just women academics, but there is a definite gendered aspect to this. And I think it's absolutely the responsibility of research funders to, as I said, expand the realm of possibility and acknowledge all the types of work that go into making. It's not just running the lab, it's not just doing the archival work. There are pastoral and professional service parts of this that are just as important and that we need to work hard to find ways of recognising.
I'm Emily Furlong, and through a discussion with other ECRs at the University of Oxford, we came up with the idea of creating low-stakes opportunities for staff and students to give feedback to their supervisors, in an effort to encourage a culture where it is normal to discuss what things are going well and how things could be improved. So I'd like to ask the panel, how can we create mechanisms for people to feel safe giving feedback to their supervisors?
Feedback giving is situated within the wider power voice culture, I suppose. So it's useful to kind of understand how feedback is heard and supported within the system. So mechanisms are okay, if by that you mean things like, 360s, but they kind of sit in the same category as whistleblowing lines, in that they only function as long as there is an element of psychological safety in the workplace. And ideally, you don't need a 360, you don't need a whistleblowing line, because you have the conversational habits within the system that mean that people can speak up with feedback as and when it's required. So I think you need to look at the whole system and culture rather than just focus on some of the mechanisms. And in particular, being able to give and receive feedback really requires the person receiving the feedback to respond well. And so one of the things I would particularly emphasize to senior leaders is when they have feedback, even if that feedback isn't given to them in an enormously sort of skillful or articulate way, which it might not be, your response will determine whether you ever receive feedback again. Okay, so you need to be able to welcome that and respond and appreciate it. Otherwise, you get into this bubble that I was talking about previously.
Hi, my name is Jasmeet Rayat, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Birmingham. It is becoming increasingly acknowledged that a diverse group of problem solvers make research institutions better positioned to find innovative solutions to complex challenges posed by science. With this in mind, my idea to build a more inclusive research culture is to develop a dedicated funding stream for Black, Asian, and ethnic minority scientists, to support their retention in academia, and to provide role models for future Black, Asian, and ethnic minority students. So I'd like to ask the panel, how can we better support the careers of people currently underrepresented in research?
Again, another really fantastic question. I'll give you an example of something we did fairly recently in Humanities and Social Science at Wellcome. The Centre for Black Humanities at Bristol University, which is one of the leading centres of academic studies of Black cultural experience and Black cultural creativity, approached us with the issue that Black researchers in the humanities are massively underrepresented within the medical humanities, which is a key area of interest for Wellcome in terms of our portfolio. And so we worked with them to develop a fairly small and financially fairly modest grant that they put together, which would give targeted support to researchers in this underrepresented and underserved community to help them seed new work, new research work, but also to put them in touch with mentors and people who have been successful in the past. So part of it is, there's one part of it which is about targeting particular support, giving people the freedom to start doing research projects, but also giving them what you might call the soft support in terms of the skills around grant making. But then that puts part of it on research themselves and helping those of us in positions of power, if you like, in research funders, have to think about how we can remove the barriers as well that we may necessarily have set up to excluded and underserved communities. And we have to work really closely with our colleagues in the diversity and inclusion profession to make sure that the structural and cultural barriers to success for minoritized ethnic communities, but indeed from all sorts of underserved and underrepresented communities are removed as much as possible, because otherwise, no matter how much targeted support is given to those communities, those barriers will remain in place and progress won't be made. And I think, actually, I will say this, and this is a personal view, that organizations like Wellcome and other research funders have got to be comfortable in saying that sometimes it's okay to give a particular community, extra help and support. It's not about changing the goalposts or lowering standards or lowering expectations. It's about saying actually that to get everyone to the same level, sometimes particular communities need extra support, extra resource, and that's all right, because the broader strategic aim is to get everyone onto a level playing field, because the playing field, as we know, is deeply, deeply uneven.
Hello, I'm Adam Smith. I'm a Programme Director at University College London. My idea to create a healthier research culture is to ensure that working hours are a standard item to be discussed at all appraisals and supervisor meetings. So I'd like to ask the panel, how can we reduce pressure on individuals and encourage a sustainable working culture? Thank you.
Now, I think the first thing to identify here is that you have to be aware that individuals are experiencing pressure. And to be honest, that's the first thing that I'm noticing is a little bit what I was talking about in the talk before, this advantage blindness. When we're in a position where things look okay, it's really easy to assume that other people are also okay. So we can't be blind to the challenges of others. And remember, as you get more senior, you actually get more optimistic and you don't notice the challenges. So you need to inquire and then inquire again and keep inquiring. Yeah. Actually, this is quite interesting with COVID when many teams moved virtually. At the beginning, quite a few people were commenting favourably because leaders in particular were reaching out and asking people how they were. And actually that hadn't been something that was particularly common before people moved virtually. Some of the research that I've been doing over the year has suggested that people have sort of stopped asking that a bit and fallen back into the habit of just assuming people are okay. So how do you know and how do you find out what challenges people are experiencing on your team? So if you're listening to this, how much time do you spend on the task and the objective of your team? And how much time do you spend inquiring into how you go about that task? And how do people feel supported and able to do that task? And if you're not spending time on that, then don't expect the task bit to work out particularly well. So we have to have those conversations in order to enable these conversations to go well.
My idea to improve research culture is to capture and analyze the gendered impact of caring responsibilities on research productivity during lockdown. So I'd like to ask the panel, How can we improve flexibility to make the sector more inclusive, and in particular in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic?
It's worth bearing in mind that it may be too soon to say that we know everything that COVID-19 has taught us about the flexibility or inflexibility of the research ecosystem. What I will say it's taught us about is that there are always different ways of doing things, and that old working patterns and old expectations, when we're forced to changing them, can be changed. For example, we're doing this conference virtually rather than all meeting in a terrible hotel somewhere drinking weak coffee. What I would say is, again, and I think this is about the obligations of research funders, is to do some properly robust research. Some members of the research community, particularly those people on whom caring burdens have fallen really heavily during the pandemic, will have had a less productive year, a less productive 18 months. How do we factor that in? How can we take learnings from this, sort of fabulous but also slightly stressful world of Zooms and Teams to enable people who have got caring responsibilities, or people who live geographically, who are distant geographically, to participate? There are all sorts of possibilities that are opening up for us, but they need to be properly and robustly researched before we all jump in and decide that we can live on Zoom or Blue Jeans forever.
Hi, I'm Lucy Donaldson. I'm the Professor of Sensory Physiology at the University of Nottingham. And I'd like to ask the panel, how would you explain what defines a positive research environment in a single sentence?
A positive research environment is one where people don't feel bad about not working on a weekend.
An environment where members feel supported and encouraged to speak up with ideas and with challenges, so that they and the research that they do can flourish.